Well, good morning, everybody. It's Pastor Alan here, and we're welcome to you on this Palm Sunday weekend. I hope everybody's doing just great, and that your basketball teams have done better than mine. Are you ready for some good news? Jesus didn't just die so that you could live. Oh, that he did. But he did much more than that. Jesus took the judgment that would have been due to you. And so when you accept Christ, you are not only made alive forever, but you are forgiven and set free. And we're going to learn today about this from one of the stories of Elijah and Elisha. We've been in a series on these two miracle men whose lives point to the true miracle man, Jesus. And as we've been sort of moving through this, we're going to kind of take a step backwards today because we looked at some of Elisha, but we're going to go back and see another story from Elijah. It's in 2 Kings, it's chapter 1. 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. It's one of those judgment stories that you read about in the Old Testament and wonder, what does that mean for us today? Well, we're going to learn. It's 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Ahab, Moab rebelled against Israel. Now, Ahaziah fell through the lattice in his upper chamber in Samaria and lay sick. So he sent messengers, telling them, "Go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this sickness." But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, "Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, is it because there's no God in Israel that you're going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus says the Lord, you shall not come down from the bed to which you've gone up, but you shall surely die." So Elijah went. And the messengers returned to the king, and he said to them, "Why have you returned?" And they said to him, "There came a man to meet us and said to us, 'Go back to the king who sent you and say to him, thus says the Lord, is it because there's no God in Israel that you're sending to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die.' Well, he said to them, 'What kind of man was he who came to meet you and told you these things?' And they answered, 'He wore a garment of hair with a belt of leather about his waist.' And he said, 'It's Elijah the Tishbite.' Then the king sent to him a captain of 50 men with his 50. And he went to Elijah, who was sitting on top of a hill, and said to him, 'O man of God, the king says, come down.' But Elijah answered the captain of 50, 'If I'm a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. And fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Again the king sent to him another captain of 50 men with his 50. And he answered and said to him, 'O man of God, this is the king's order. Come down quickly.' But Elijah answered them, 'If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. And the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Again, the king sent the captain of a third 50 with his 50. And the third captain of 50 went up and came and fell on his knees before Elijah and entreated him, 'O man of God, please let my life and the life of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight.' Behold, fire came down from heaven and consumed the two former captains of 50 men with their 50s. But now let my life be precious in your sight." And the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, "Go down with him, do not be afraid of him." So he arose and went down with him to the king and said, "Thus says the Lord, because you have sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die." So he died according to the word of the Lord that Elijah had spoken. Well, there was a small plane, and in addition to the pilot, had 4 passengers. When the engines went out, the pilot came back and he said, "Everybody put on a parachute and jump. It's the only way we're going to survive." The pilot put on a parachute, he jumped out. And the other passengers were a doctor, a lawyer, a pastor, and a young boy. And immediately the doctor said, "Well, I'm a doctor and I save people's lives. I've got to have a parachute." And he reached down to grab, and they realized there were only 3 parachutes for the 4 of them. And so the doctor greedily grabbed one and said, "Well, I'm just too important." He threw it on and he jumped out of the plane with a parachute. Whereupon the lawyer said, I went to Harvard Law School, and I'm the smartest man alive. I said, everybody needs me. And so he grabbed the pack and he jumped out. And there they were, the pastor and this little boy. And the pastor looked at the boy and he said, son, he said, I've lived a long and a full life. And I tell you what, he said, you take the remaining parachute because you got your whole life in front of you, and go and live in peace. And the little boy smiled and looked up at the pastor and said, no worries, pastor. He reached behind the seat. He said, because the smartest man in the world just jumped out with my school backpack. You often think of what Jesus has done for you as your Savior. And a lot of people would immediately point and say, well, he died so that I could live forever. And when you trust in Christ, it is a great dimension of the wonderful news of the gospel that Jesus died so that you don't have to die. But what I want to show you today is that Jesus is not that nice pastor who willingly gives the last parachute to you, but instead Jesus has done something far greater than that. And the gospel is much better than most people know. A lot of people say, well, the Old Testament God seems to be a God of wrath and all this judgment, but the New Testament God, Jesus, he looks like he's so nice, and maybe God changed his demeanor, over time. But we have one God, and God's never changed. And I want to show you today by going through one of those stories that at first seems really harsh about fire falling down and consuming these people. What could this possibly be telling us about the gospel? And I think you're going to see some wonderful, good news in it. Okay, here's what happened. Let's just kind of go through this story. Ahaziah is the son of Ahab, who was the king that the Bible says was more wicked than any of the kings before him, any of the kings of Israel. Ahab was married to Jezebel, and Jezebel's name is famous because she was so evil and controlling, and Jezebel loved to worship Baal. And she supported like 450 prophets of the pagan Baal deity. Jezebel and Ahab eventually met their demise under Elijah's ministry, in which there was this incredible scene where God came down on Mount Carmel and he consumed the altar that Elijah had set up, but all the prophets of Baal were defeated that day, and it was a huge blow to idolatry in the land, and eventually Ahab died. But this Ahaziah, the new king, was the son of Ahab and Jezebel, and he obviously didn't learn anything from all of the judgment that had come upon his parents. He continued in this same sort of wickedness. He walked in the way, the scripture says, of his father and his mother. Interestingly, there's no other place where it speaks of a man's wickedness by saying he walked in the way of his mother, but it says that of Ahaziah about he walking in the way of Jezebel. He was an evil person. And so Ahaziah fell. Basically, it looks like that the banister broke on the stairways, and he fell down the stairs, and he's quite wounded from this, and he's wondering whether or not he's going to live. So what he does, instead of calling out to God, here's the king of Israel, and he sends messengers to go consult with Baal-zebub in Ekron, a Philistine city, where there may be an oracle or fortune tellers, really. So he's more interested in sort of getting his fortune told. He wants to hear what he wants to hear, and he wants to relieve his situation and his soul by knowing all the details of the future. This is not the way God comforts us. He doesn't give us all the details of the future. God comforts us in the midst of our uncertainties because we live our life by walking in faith. But Ahaziah didn't want to walk by faith, and he didn't want to call upon the God of Israel. So instead, he sent messengers to go call upon Baal-zebub. It's almost a piece of humor, Baal-zebub, because it means Lord of the Flies. It sounds a whole lot like Baal-zebul, which is Baal the prince. And some people say, well, it really was Baal-zebul, Lord Baal the prince, but it just over time got mispronounced and became Beelzebub. Or maybe this is just the Lord putting it in the word that you might as well call him Beelzebub, because that's about all he's Lord of, is the flies. He can't control anything more than a fly, and what he does have control of is disgusting. But God sends Elijah to intercept King Ahaziah's messengers on their way to Ekron. And he tells them this word of the Lord, that you'll surely die. And the servants return, and they tell King Ahaziah what Elijah has said. Do you see the incredible irony of this? Do you see the irony of this? That Ahaziah is sending messengers to go consult with Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, to get, in a sense, his fortune told so he could know the future. And yet Beelzebub doesn't even exist, and if he did, he wouldn't be Lord of anything more than the flies. He couldn't tell the future to these messengers. And yet God, the God of Israel, the one true God who knows all things, who's absolutely omniscient, knows everything that's going on, and he sends Elijah to intercept the messengers and tell them what really is going on. It's so ironic that Ahaziah wants to get a word, and yet he gets interrupted by God, who comes to give him a real word. God will often go to great lengths to intercept idolatry. And Ahaziah thinks that he can intimidate Elijah. The reason I think he believes he can intimidate Elijah is because his mother did. If you remember the stories, Elijah defeats 450 prophets of Baal. And then in the very next scene, 1 Kings chapter 19, Jezebel threatens Elijah. And Elijah just astonishingly becomes depressed and runs for his life, and he becomes suicidal out in the middle of the desert. And as we've learned, it is interesting how in life, sometimes after these great, even big spiritual moments, you can be prepared for the voice of shame, because the accuser doesn't stop there. They say, look at you, you're still not good enough. You still are under a threat. And somehow, when you feel like you've given it your all and it didn't seem like enough, that there's accusation that comes, and Elijah was afraid. And so instead of Ahaziah, the king, the son of Ahab and Jezebel, instead of him saying, my parents came under the judgment of God because of their idolatry, and I want to follow God, instead he just walked in the way of his mother and his father, and their way was to try to intimidate the prophet of God and control destiny by controlling. So he thought he could intimidate Elijah. He sends 50 soldiers. And Elijah's sitting up on a hill. Some people say maybe he's up on Mount Carmel, where he was at the great scene and confrontation of the prophets of Baal. But he's up at a higher place. And so the people are down below him, and they call up to him and say, come down, it's an order. They're trying to order the prophet what to do. And this prophet's not intimidated this time. Something has changed. After his depression in the desert, the Lord had come by an angel and fed Elijah, said, here, take some food. And then had said to Elijah, get up, for the journey is great in front of you. And he goes to Mount Horeb, and he hides in a cave, and the Lord came in a great earthquake, and everything shook, but there wasn't the sound of the voice of the Lord in that. And then there was a huge tornado that tore through the side of the mountain. But the sound of the voice of the Lord was not in the wind. And then a raging brush fire came. But the voice of the Lord was not in the fire. It wasn't in the earth or the wind or the fire. But then there came a gentle whisper. And the Lord whispered to Elijah. And Elijah had a conversation like no other conversation he'd ever had with the Lord. He had experienced the glory and the might of God. But now, in this hillside at Mount Horeb, he heard the secrets of God's love. He had a conversation with God. He experienced the intimacy of God's friendship. And he was changed by that. So now Elijah sits on a mountain, and Jezebel's son threatens him, but this time he is unintimidatable. You know, I think it's a word for somebody. Just like Elijah was no longer intimidated because he had something that had changed on the inside of him. He wasn't the same person that he was. I just think the Lord wants somebody to know you're not the same person that you were. There's more in you now than there used to be. You have experienced something of the intimacy of God that you at one time in your life had not experienced. And it has changed you from the inside. And the voice of the accuser that used to be able to take you down into a low place cannot pull you down in that same way anymore. And if you're hearing the taunts of the enemy now, I think the Lord is just saying, remember the still small voice that you have heard. You have a confidence in Christ. You are more than a conqueror, and you now are able to sit in quiet confidence in the face of the enemy's accusations. It's a blessed thing when you've gone to the cave, heard the still small voice, and moved beyond a great fear. Everything changed. They called up to him and said, "Man of God, come down." I wonder about this, and I wonder why they said, "Man of God." What was their tone of voice? And I think it's mockery. This is me guessing at this, but I think it's mockery because it's very much the way they treated Jesus. You remember? They put a crown of thorns on him, and they called him the King of the Jews. And they said, look, he saved others, he can't save himself. They were essentially mocking him in this exact same way. Come down if you are the man of God. And Elijah speaks back to them with irony and says, if I am a man of God, then instead of me coming down, let fire come down. And upon this army of wicked soldiers who serve a wicked king, who worship the Lord of the flies, fire comes down and the judgment of God comes upon them. Fire is, at most places in the Old Testament and really throughout the New, a symbol of the judgment of God or a symbol of the passion and purity of his holiness. Fire falls, judgment comes. Which is to say that God was the rightful judge. The one who can call down fire, the one who can issue the judgment, that's the judge. That's by definition. The one who can sit in the seat of the judge and tell what is right and what is wrong and can issue the sentences, that's the judge. And we're not that person. And that's why it's so important that Jesus says to us over and over, judge not that you be not judged. God's the judge. And this is a scene, a moment in time where it just shows God being the judge. The reason that Baal can't call down fire is because he's a worthless idol. He can't issue any judgment. He's not in the seat of the judge. The judge is the one who can change the things. Now, our church, some years ago, was in a lawsuit, and it really was a meaningless lawsuit that was born out of the fears of some of our neighbors that thought we were going to disrespect the neighborhood by growing too much and so forth. And we tried to mediate this thing along the way, and then we had the best mediator in the state of North Carolina go back and forth between the two sides to see and they just wouldn't agree to anything. And so finally, our lawyers drew up a brief asking a judge. We went to the court to ask a judge to dismiss the thing, to issue a summary judgment, it's called. And on that day, that Superior Court judge, he came and he started talking to us. He said, well, tell me what's going on. Why can't you just get this settled? And we began to explain to him, Your Honor, said, here's what's been going on, and here's the things that the people that are accusing us are saying, and here's what they want us to do. And he said, well, let me just go talk to them. And we said, well, Your Honor, we have tried to mediate, but nothing's happened. He said, well, let me talk to them. And he came back over, he said, they're willing to talk to you. And we were like, oh, okay. Something's changed here. And after moment, he would say, well, what's going on? We'd tell him. He said, well, let me go talk to them about that. And he came back and said, well, they're agreeable. They had they had wanted to insist, for example, that our church not show a video venue in the fellowship hall. I'm afraid that we get too big and too crowded and so forth. The judge said, "Are you talking about the way we do at my church, where we show a video in the fellowship hall if there's a big crowd?" We said, "Yes, Your Honor." He said, "Well, let me go talk to them about that." And he came back. He said, "They're okay with that." And by the end of the day, we had this thing settled. And that was the day I realized that man in a black robe can get some things done, because he could, if he wanted to, throw the whole thing out that day. He could issue a summary judgment, and the case was over, and everybody knew it. So he wasn't just a kind mediator going back and forth. He was the judge who had power to make decisions according to his own conscience. And that's what a judge is. And if I'm a man of God, then let the fire fall. And it does. It really is, beloved, a picture. I'd really encourage you to see this way, especially to our modern sensibilities that are bothered by anything of the idea of God as a judge. To begin with this, that what would happen to this world, to this cosmos, if there were not some benevolent force holding it all together? And what would happen in our lives if there were not common grace? If there were no protection from God? I think what you see here is that this is God lifting off his protective mercies for just a moment to say, if you rebel against God, if you walk in the ways of wickedness, because this earth is founded on justice, judgment would fall. And you see, justice is only justice if there is punishment of wrong and reward for right. Regardless of the spirit of the age that wants to make as if we can just tolerate everything and be nice. The fact of the matter is, everybody I've ever known has a yearning, a thirst for justice. Pay attention to your thirst for justice. It's telling you something. It's telling you something about this world. It's telling you something about the design of it. And it's telling you something about God. We are watching an old episode of Blue Bloods on Netflix, a family of cops, and one of which the patriarch is the commissioner of the New York City Police. And in this particular episode, these smug, arrogant, prosperous, young real estate developers go to a party at a bar, get drunk, walk out, stumble out the back door, where they encounter in the alleyway a homeless man, a veteran who doesn't want to bother anybody, but they start talking to him, and they see that he has a medal. It's a silver star for his valor, and it's the one thing he has. And what happens is these drunken, smug men who never fought a day for anybody, didn't care about anybody but themselves, they go over and they try to steal away this homeless man's one little possession, this silver star or medal of his, and the homeless man tries to take it back, and then next thing you know, they're punching him, and these men are just, they're brutally beating up this homeless man, and then one of them grabs a bat and hits him, kicks him, and they leave him for dead while the drunken men walk off laughing. It's a terrible scene. Well, the case is assigned to Danny Reagan, who himself, like that homeless man, was a veteran, a Marine. And he's mad, and he's specially motivated to go find these guys. And he finally finds them, and when enough proof comes in, and he goes to arrest the ringleader, the man who had killed this homeless man, and they fight with each other. And at first, it looks like the guy's about to kill Detective Reagan, but then he gets the upper hand, and he starts hitting him. And you're just watching this show, and I'm just sitting there, I'm watching with my family. I forget I'm a pastor. I forget I'm a Christian. I forget everything. And I'm just like, hit him harder, just hit him harder, you know. And Reagan is saying, "You want to see what it feels like, tough guy? Bam!" You know, he's like, and you're just like, "Yeah, go for it." You know, and you just totally forget everything. Why? Because we have a thirst for justice. I don't know, watch a show. There are no shows. Who wants to watch a show where every episode it shows something like smug businessmen that go in a drunken stupor and kill a homeless guy and then just walk away with it and the show ends and then they come back and do another show like that? Who wants to watch a show like that? Nobody. Because we have a hunger and a thirst for justice. The problem is that our hunger and thirst for justice is something we'd like to see for other people more than ourselves. The other day I was riding two-lane road, and I'm just riding, thankfully, it was kind of a slow speed limit there, and nobody's going fast, but I'm just riding in my lane. I look up, and a car's just riding right towards me in my lane. I don't know if she was talking on the phone, texting, putting on makeup, or adjusting the radio, or doing all three or four at the same time. Could have been, I don't know, but just riding straight towards me. So I got on the horn, and she looked up and jerked the car over, and honestly, she got over in plenty of time because I was on the horn, but I felt it was important to stay on the horn until she came all the way past me. You know what I'm talking about? The horn has already served its purpose, but now I'm just giving her the horn of shame as she goes by. Because, a little bit of justice here, right? You quit texting and drive your car. You're about to run straight head on into me. Why? Because there's got to be some justice around here. You know that feeling? It's like somebody comes weaving through traffic, speeding past you, and that little party be like, I hope they get a ticket. I hope they get pulled in the next 10 seconds. Well, what is that? You want justice. But the problem is that we want justice for other people, or we want what our version of justice is. I've never taken a baseball bat to an innocent homeless man. I never would. But I have driven on the wrong side of the road. My daughter and I went to Papua New Guinea on a mission trip. We had some time in Australia on the way over, and you drive on the left-hand side of the road, and it's all these roundabouts and roundabouts, and she said over there, Daddy, stay left, Daddy, stay left. I went around one of the roundabouts, and I tried to turn over this way. I just lost my senses, and I turned, and I got in the right-hand lane. I looked up, and here the cars were coming at me. I was that person. See, what the Bible teaches very clearly, and it's completely contrary to the spirit of the age, is that we are not morally neutral. You might say, well, I'm not like that person that would go beat up a homeless man. No. But all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glories of God. So when we want justice, at the same time, what we really want is mercy. We know there needs to be justice, but we want mercy. R.C. Sproul, well-known theologian and author, said that when he was teaching a class of 250 students in an Old Testament survey, he told them at the beginning, he said, we got 3 short papers. They're 5 pages each. One's due on September 30, one's due on October 30, and one's due on November 30, and they must be turned in on that day or before, or else you will receive an F in the class. And he said the day of the first paper came, and about 25 students came in and didn't have their paper. And they came up to him and they said, oh, Dr. Sproul said, we have been so stressed with other midterms and other things going on, and we couldn't. And they gave him all the excuses, please, please, please. And he said, okay, I'm going to give you an extension one time. You got 3 days. He said the second paper rolled around, and this time 50 students came in and said, Dr. Sproul, can we have an extension like that you gave the other students last time? Because, and Dr. Sproul gave him a 3-day extension. He said the paper that was due on November 30th, he said, it's like half the class walked in. Out of the 250 students, there were over 100 students. They came in and they didn't have their paper. And they were like, okay, professor, sorry, we'll get it into you in a couple days, in the extension time. And he said, everybody sit down. And he pulled out his little black book, and he said, okay, raise your hand if you don't have your paper. And he started writing down their names. Okay, Fitzgerald, F. Johnson, F. Smith. F. And some student called out and said, that's not fair. And this theologian professor had a teachable moment. He said, oh, it's not fair? They said, yeah. He said, so you want me to do the fair thing? And they said, yes. And he said, okay, Johnson, he said, didn't you not turn your paper in on time last time? Well, yes, sir. He said, okay, I'm going to go back, and took his eraser and he said, I'm going to give you F on that one too. That's what I said I was going to do. That's the just thing, right? Smith, didn't you have your paper in like that? And the class was like, speechless then. And he just made his point. He said, what you want from God is not justice. What you need from God is grace. And the moment that you think that grace is just something that is just because God's nice, you have missed the depth and the richness of the gospel. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ is not about this God who suddenly turned nice from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and now he's Jesus, and he just pats the little children on the head. No, something else more magnificent has happened. What's so fascinating about this is that in the New Testament, we come to a scene in the life of Jesus that mirrors the Elijah event that we read about today. If you want to turn there, it's in Luke chapter 9 at verse 51. Now, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. This is the pivot of the book of Luke, right here, Luke 9 at verse 51. From this time on, it's all about going to the cross. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. So the Samaritans and the Jews hated each other. They believed the Jews believed the Samaritans were a mixed breed. And the Samaritans hated them and believed that they shouldn't worship at Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, listen to this. They came to Jesus and they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Why did they say that? They said it because they knew the story of Elijah. And they've got Jesus. And they're thinking, we've got Jesus. He's the better Elijah. I mean, Elijah had a lot of power, but Jesus, he can control the storms at sea and speak words, and people are healed and brought back to life. We've got the real Jesus here. We've got the Lord with us, and he's going to want us to do to these wicked people just like Elijah. And he said, do you want us to call fire down on them? But the text says, but Jesus turned and rebuked them. And they went to another village. So instead of Jesus saying, yeah, we need to rebuke these wicked Samaritans, Jesus rebuked the disciples for wanting to call fire down on them. It was like the opposite experience of what happened with Elijah. And interestingly, in Luke chapter 12, we hear some words of this Jesus who says, no, we're not going to call fire down. Who says at Luke chapter 12, verse 49, the words of Jesus, I came to cast fire on the earth, and would that it were already kindled. And then he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished. So how could Jesus say, no, I didn't come to condemn, and yet, on the other hand, say, I came to cast fire on the earth? And as has been noted by commentators and an insight from Tim Keller, that this is a literary device that is parallel repetition, where you have a sentence and then you say another sentence that means the same thing but using different words. In other words, he says, I came to cast fire on the earth, would that were already kindled. And then he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with, how great my distress is until it's accomplished. See, Jesus has already been baptized. He was baptized at the River Jordan by John the Baptist. But what is he saying here? He's saying, I've come to cast fire. And he said, I've got to be baptized. I've got to be immersed. What is he going to be immersed in? What Jesus is saying here is unimaginable, and this is where the essence of the gospel gets put into vibrant display. Jesus came to cast fire, but not upon the Samaritans, not upon you and me, but upon himself. He came to take the judgment. God didn't change from the Old Testament to the New Testament. God has always been a God of justice. And the importance of justice has never diminished. It's just that none of us, if we're going to get justice, would ever be rewarded. We would all be punished. And so God came in the person of Jesus Christ He himself went to the cross, and the fire of God's wrath against sin came upon Christ himself. When you trust in Jesus, he who knew no sin, Jesus, becomes your sin. And by the miracle of God's grace, you who deserved the fire of his judgment instead are given the fullness of the blessing that should have been reserved only for Jesus. So what it means for us is that we are no longer under any condemnation and have no fear of God. And it means for us that our lives are filled with a gratitude that changes everything. And it means, therefore, as unbelievable as it sounds, that when you're a Christian now, justice is still important, but justice is on your side because you have been so forgiven that you've been declared innocent, and there's no double jeopardy. You can't be tried for what Jesus has already been tried for. You cannot ever be judged by God because the judgment has already fallen upon Christ. And this is why we are so joyful. We have become the righteousness of God in Jesus Christ, and we need not fear him. We need not ever hesitate to come to him because we are his children and we're loved by him with an everlasting love. So Jesus isn't the nice pastor on the airplane saying, "Here, take my parachute." He is the one who's borne the whole crash of the airplane so it doesn't crash anymore and you can soar with the wings of an eagle. And that's the gospel.